Hi, I'm Dr. Matt Goldstone, and in this series we're exploring the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew in light of early Jewish literature. In this final video, we'll examine the organization of the Antitheses in chapter 5 of the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount contains 6 different units, often referred to as the Antitheses, in which Jesus is presented as responding to existing laws and authoritative traditions. Some scholars suggest that this list of 6 actually divides in half, into 2 groups of 3. This is partially due to the fact that the 4th antithesis, on oaths, starts with the word again, which marks a point of transition from the first 3 antitheses to the last 3. The question that interests us is why the different antitheses are organized in the way that we find them. Let's start by taking a look at the first 3. The organization of the first 3 antitheses is often linked to the Decalogue. The prohibitions on murder and adultery correspond to 2 of the 10 commandments. Divorce is then assumed to follow adultery as another marriage-related teaching. So there's a compelling reason behind the grouping of the first 3 antitheses. But what about the last 3 antitheses? What's the connection between oaths, eye for an eye, and love of enemies? The key lies in an early exegetical tradition that we examined in the previous video. Let's briefly review. In the last video, I suggested that Antitheses 5 and 6 in the Sermon on the Mount relate to an interpretation of Leviticus 19:17-18 preserved in the Midrash known as Sifra. Both Matthew and the Midrash move from a discussion of slapping or injuring to lending and borrowing to love of others. For more details, see the previous video, but for the moment, I'll assume that the material underlying the last 2 antitheses is directly linked to Leviticus 19:17 and 19:18. So the question becomes, can we find a link between oaths, Leviticus 19:17, and Leviticus 19:18? In fact, if we look to the Dead Sea Scrolls, we can. In one of these scrolls, known as the Damascus document, we find a section that moves from a discussion of Leviticus 19:18 to Leviticus 19:17 to oaths. The passage starts by quoting the beginning of Leviticus 19:18. It then goes on to say that anyone who brings an accusation against their fellow, not before witnesses, or in the heat of anger, or to bring the other into disrepute, that person is a vengeance taker and a grudge bearer. However, if the person kept silent, and then spoke in the heat of anger, then they have not fulfilled the commandment of rebuke found in Leviticus 19:17. The Damascus document immediately goes on to a new section labeled About Oaths. So the Damascus document moves from Leviticus 19:18 to Leviticus 19:17 to oaths, the exact opposite direction from the Gospel of Matthew. The connection between Leviticus 19:17-18 and oaths that we find in the Sermon on the Mount also appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In addition, there may be another link between these Levitical verses and oaths in the Testament of Gad. In chapter 6 of the Testament of God, we find a statement about loving one's brother related to Leviticus 19:18, mention of banishing hatred from your heart, which alludes to Leviticus 19:17, and mention of oaths. So the connection between Leviticus 19:17-18 and oaths that we observed in the last 3 antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount also appears in 2 other ancient sources, the Damascus document and the Testament of God. This juxtaposition between the verses from Leviticus and oaths may even continue into the Rabbinic period, where we find a text that connects the 10 Commandments, Leviticus 19:17-18, and oaths. The Midrash, Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, glosses Exodus 13:19, which begins, "And Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, exacting an oath from the children of Israel." Commenting on the line, "Moses took the bones of Joseph with him," Mechilta states that Joseph fulfilled all of the 10 Commandments, and that he fulfilled Leviticus 19:17-18, as well as Leviticus 25:36, which is about not taking interest when lending. The Midrash then moves on to the next part of the original verse from Exodus, about exacting an oath, to say that Moses made the people swear and impose an oath on their children. This Midrash is particularly interesting because it maps onto all of the antitheses. Joseph's fulfillment of the 10 Commandments corresponds to the first 3 antitheses, which relate to the Decalogue. Joseph's fulfillment of Leviticus 19:17-18 aligns with the last 2 antitheses, which I've suggested are based on an interpretation of these verses. In addition, Mention of Leviticus 25:36, which prohibits lending with interest, also connects to the interpretation of Leviticus 19:18. And finally, Moses making the people swear and impose oaths on their children aligns with the fourth antithesis about oaths. While we may not know the reason that so many sources from antiquity juxtapose Leviticus 19:17 through 18 and oaths, the fact that several ancient Jewish texts make this connection helps us to better understand why these topics may have been organized into the last three antitheses in the Sermon on the Mount. For more on this topic, see my article, The Structure of Matthew's Antitheses in Light of Early Jewish, Christian, and Rabbinic Sources, in the Journal for the Study of the New Testament. I hope that this short series has helped you to see how Jewish literature from late antiquity can help us to better understand the Sermon on the Mount. Thanks for watching.